Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
Sael Vorn had, in 7 years of service aboard Meridian Frontier Station, cleaned approximately 4,000 rooms. She had done this without complaint, without incident, and without once being asked how she was doing by anyone whose name she knew. This was not, she had decided early on, a tragedy. It was a professional arrangement. The rooms were dirty. She made them clean. The people in the rooms were, by and large, unaware of this process in the same comfortable way they were unaware of the atmospheric processors that kept them breathing, which is to say, entirely, until something stopped working. Nothing had stopped working yet. This was, on the whole, a record she was proud of. She began her Thursday rotation at the service bay on Meridian's third diplomatic tier at precisely 600 hours, which was the time her shift began, and also, by no coincidence, the exact time that the tier's senior duty officer changed over, leaving a 4-minute window during which neither officer was technically in charge of corridor access verification. Sael had not engineered this window. She had simply noticed it, the way she noticed everything about the spaces she maintained. The way a musician notices the acoustics of a room without meaning to, because noticing is what the work requires. She noted it every Thursday. She never used it for anything. She filed it in the same internal catalog as the fact that Conference Room 3 had a ventilation seam that carried sound from the adjacent communications buffer with perfect clarity, and that the Theresi ambassador's personal suite had a loose floor panel behind the left reading chair that lifted cleanly if you applied pressure at the rear left corner. She knew these things the way water knows the shape of the vessel it fills. She simply existed in the spaces, and the spaces, eventually, told her everything about themselves. Her cart was compact standard issue, a low-profile sanitation unit in the particular shade of gray that the compact used for anything it wanted people to stop looking at. It carried, in its various sealed compartments, a rotating selection of cleaning compounds calibrated for 17 different surface materials, 2 atmospheric sample collectors for rooms flagged for post-occupancy air quality verification, a personal flask of Shet that was technically in violation of the no personal items in cart regulation, and which she had been not technically violating for 3 years without comment from anyone, and in the lower left compartment, a small folded photograph, not digital, an actual physical photograph, printed on thermal paper by a machine on the Aethari home system that her brother Ver had sent it through on a freight route 2 years ago, because he knew she liked objects you could hold. The photograph showed 3 people standing in front of something that looked, to human eyes, like an extremely large blue fern. To Sael, it was the tidal garden outside her childhood residence, and the 3 people were herself, Ver, and their mother, all of them doing the Aethari equivalent of squinting into the sun, which involved the amber rings of their irises contracting to near invisibility, giving their faces the briefly startled expression of people who had been surprised by something beautiful and weren't yet sure how to feel about it. She kept the photograph in the lower left compartment because the lower left compartment had the most reliable seal, and because she was, in the matter of things she loved, very careful. The first 6 rooms of her Thursday rotation were unremarkable, which was the condition she preferred. The suite occupied by the junior trade attaché from the human colony block had, as always, accumulated an impressive quantity of beverage containers for a person living alone, arranged in a loose semicircle around the primary workstation in a pattern that suggested either very long nights or a complicated relationship with hydration. The shared dining annex on the eastern corridor had a persistent condensation issue along the upper wall seam that she had logged 4 times with maintenance, and which maintenance had, on 4 separate occasions, responded to with the particular energy of a department that has misplaced your message and is hoping you will eventually stop sending it. She cleaned around the condensation. She logged it a 5th time. She noted in the log that she had now logged it 5 times, in the same neutral professional tone she used for everything, because if you are going to be passive-aggressive about a wall seam, you should at least be consistent. It was in the corridor between the Eastern Annex and Conference Room 7 that she first noticed something was different about the night that had just passed. She noticed it not through any particular observation, but through the air itself. Recycled station atmosphere carries memory, in a way that no filtration system fully eliminates, and the air coming from the direction of Room 7 had the specific quality of a space where too many people had been anxious in a small room for too long, which Sael had come to think of, privately, as the smell of history being made badly. She had encountered it before. It usually meant a difficult morning and a lot of overturned cups. She straightened her service cap, which she did not need to straighten but which she straightened anyway when she was preparing herself for something, in the way that small adjustments to small things sometimes anchor a person before a large thing begins. Then she turned the cart toward Conference Room 7, pushed open the service entrance, and went in to see what the night had left behind. Conference Room 7 had, in the taxonomy of spaces Sael maintained, a personality. Not a pleasant one exactly, but a consistent one, which she had come to respect in the way you respect a colleague who is reliably difficult. At least you know what you are getting. The room was used primarily for mid-tier strategy sessions, the kind of meetings that were too important for a shared annex but not important enough to warrant the first-tier conference suites, which had better chairs and a window. Room 7 had no window. It had instead a wall-length display panel that someone had, years before Sael's rotation, hung 3 centimeters off-level, and which no one had ever corrected because, by the time anyone noticed it, the decision of whose job it was to correct it had become more complicated than the problem itself. Sael had looked at that slightly tilted display panel for 3 years. She found it, quietly, the most honest thing on the entire diplomatic tier. The room was, as she had expected, a record of a bad evening. 2 chairs pushed back at angles that suggested standing in a hurry. The central display still running, showing the compact seal on a slow rotation, blue and self-important. 3 water glasses, one on its side, not broken, just defeated. Someone had left a personal notation folio open on the side table, its screen still lit, displaying what appeared to be a half-completed risk assessment that ended mid-sentence, which Sael found poignant in the specific way that all abandoned sentences are poignant, the words sitting there still waiting for the rest of their thought to come back and finish them. She began at the perimeter. She always began at the perimeter, despite what the official compact facilities maintenance guidelines recommended, because the official compact facilities maintenance guidelines had been written by someone who had clearly never actually cleaned a room, and because the perimeter was where things ended up when the people who owned them stopped paying attention to where things were going. The far left corner yielded a stylus and 3 individually wrapped compact tissue nutrition wafers, the kind distributed as meeting refreshments that no one ever eats during the meeting but everyone takes with them afterward, and then leaves in various corners of the station for Sael to find, such that she had, over 3 years, developed an almost archaeological map of where nutrition wafers turned up, and what it suggested about the emotional state of whoever had pocketed and then abandoned them. The right wall was clean. The area near the door was clean. The section behind the mobile partition screen, the collapsible divider that got wheeled out whenever a meeting wanted the theatrical impression of additional confidentiality, was where she found it. She almost didn't. It was in the narrow channel between the partition's weighted base and the wall, a space roughly 4 centimeters wide that existed for no architectural reason other than that whoever had installed the partition had not fully committed to pushing it flush against the surface, and which Sael cleaned because she cleaned everything, including the spaces that didn't know they were supposed to exist. The chip was the size of her thumbnail. Matte gray, compact standard format, the kind used for secure briefing materials, with the small red classification band along one edge that meant it was not supposed to be in a channel behind a partition. It was supposed to be in someone's secure folio, or in a locked transit case, or in any of the 12 other designated locations that classified materials were supposed to occupy, none of which were the floor of conference room 7. She picked it up. She turned it over in her fingers. Her four-fingered hand, longer and more articulated than a human hand, held it the way a hand holds something small and potentially significant, with a kind of careful neutrality that doesn't commit to a decision yet. The red classification band caught the room's light. Protocol was not ambiguous. Found materials of this type went to station security as lost property, logged within the hour. This was the rule. It was a sensible rule. It was the kind of rule that existed because someone had, at some earlier point in institutional history, not followed it, and the consequences had generated enough paperwork to justify a standing policy. She put it in her pocket. She would, she told herself, check what was on it first, just to confirm its classification level so she could fill out the lost property log with accurate information. This was, she was aware even as she thought it, an explanation that would not survive any serious examination. But it was 4 in the morning, and she was alone in a conference room with a classified chip, and the atmospheric processors had just cycled through a pressure adjustment that made the station sound briefly like something enormous inhaling. And she was, in some way she couldn't immediately name, already certain that whatever was on this chip was the reason the room smelled the way it smelled. She finished cleaning. She righted the defeated water glass. She gathered the notation folio and placed it on the return pile for the administrative office. She powered down the display screen, which stopped rotating the compact seal with what she could only interpret as reluctant dignity. She replaced the nutrition wafers in the refreshment disposal bin and filed a mental note that whoever had left them there was, nutritionally, living dangerously. Then she wheeled her cart into the service corridor, locked it in its bay, sat down on the maintenance bench, which had, on its surface, 3 adhesive decorative decals of uncertain provenance, including one small image of a Terran animal called a capybara that she had always found inexplicably calming, and took her personal reader from her inner pocket. The chip went in. The first security gate opened on her station ID. The second opened on the same. The third, which should not have opened at all, offered a moment of resistance, and then, with the particular indifference of a system whose last authorized user had left in too much of a hurry to properly re-engage its locks, opened anyway. There were 47 slides. She read all of them. When she finished, she sat very still for a moment, and then she looked at the capybara decal, and then she looked at the chip, and then she looked at the capybara again, because she was looking for something stable to rest her eyes on, and the capybara was, at this particular moment, the best available option. It looked back at her with the expression of an animal that has never once worried about anything, which she found, under the circumstances, almost offensive. 3 billion people, 6 weeks, her brother's face, the tidal garden, the photograph in the lower left compartment. She reached for her flask of Shet and discovered she had already finished it, which was genuinely the second worst thing that had happened to her tonight. The first plan lasted 4 minutes and ended when she remembered that station security reported to Admiral Jasek Pren, whose name appeared on slide 14 of the document she had just read as Operational Command Authority, which was the kind of detail that transformed report to security from a plan into something more closely resembling a very direct method of introducing yourself to the people trying to invade your planet. She set it aside. She made a mental note to feel something about it later when she had more time to be appropriately horrified and moved on. The second plan was the Compact Diplomatic Oversight Bureau, whose charter technically covered exactly this kind of situation, and whose nearest field office was 11 days transit away on Theresi Station, and which operated, in Sael's direct professional experience, she had once filed a facilities access complaint with them regarding the condensation issue, on a timeline that treated urgency as a philosophical position rather than a practical one. She had received a response to her condensation complaint in 6 weeks. She did not have 6 weeks to spare. She had 6 weeks total, and she needed most of them for the other parts of the problem. The third plan involved Peth Doral, the Aethari cultural liaison attached to Meridian's diplomatic registry, who was technically her most direct institutional resource, and who was currently on a 12-day leave on Varentha's Prime. A fact she knew because she had cleaned his office last week, and his desk had contained, alongside his absence notification and plant watering instructions written in the careful, slightly guilty handwriting of someone who knows they are asking a lot, a framed image of himself and his husband at what appeared to be a scenic overlook on a planet with 2 small moons, both of them looking very happy in the specific way that people look very happy when they are somewhere that is not Meridian Frontier Station. She could not reach him in time. She hoped the moons were worth it. By the time she had rejected plans 4 through 6, anonymous transmission, which the station's comm filtering would flag immediately. The Diaspora Freight Network, which was beautiful for birthday greetings and structurally inadequate for military intelligence. And a version of events in which she simply walked into the first-tier diplomatic suites and told someone important, which she had abandoned the moment she tried to picture herself doing it. Because she had cleaned those suites for 3 years and was reasonably certain that not one of the people who slept in them had ever registered her as a source of geopolitical information. It was past 4 in the morning, and she had been sitting on the maintenance bench long enough that her back was developing an opinion about it. Plan 7 was stealing a ship. It lasted less than a minute. She didn't have a pilot's certification. She didn't have a docking override code. She didn't have any of the other things that stealing a ship requires. And she was, in addition to all of this, a person who had spent 7 years building a professional reputation on the principle that things should be returned to the condition in which they were found, which applied, she felt, to ships as much as to conference rooms. She abandoned Plan 7. She sat with the absence of plans for a moment, which was not comfortable but which she had learned, over a life that had required periodic sitting with difficult absences, was sometimes necessary before anything useful could happen. And then slowly, the way a room comes back into focus after the lights adjust, Akwar Sen arrived in her thinking. Not dramatically. He arrived the way he always arrived, which was unhurriedly and with some tangential remark about freight logistics, because that was the kind of person he was. She had met him 14 months ago when he began running the supply route that included, on its manifest, the dried shet leaves that the station imported for its small Aethari service population. And their first conversation had consisted of him handing her a freight confirmation form and mentioning that his route took him past a remarkable number of systems that seemed, in his estimation, to be going through a lot of trouble to seem unimportant. She had not known what to do with this observation at the time. She had signed the form and thanked him, but she had remembered it, the way she remembered all the details of the spaces she moved through, because it was the remark of someone who had also learned to notice things that weren't meant to be noticed. His route passed through the outer edge of the Aethari home system on its long leg. Not through the system, past it, close enough to reach the civilian relay beacon at the territorial boundary, the public communications infrastructure that the compact maintained for registered civilian vessels, and which was, critically, not the same infrastructure that the compact monitored for unusual encrypted transmissions originating from classified materials adjacent service workers. The relay was old. It was slow. It was not fast enough to deliver a message as though the situation were an emergency, but it was fast enough to deliver one as though it were simply a message, which was, she had decided, better. Emergencies attracted attention. Messages from freight pilots were invisible. She would need to copy the chip. She had access to the format conversion unit in the service operations room. She would need Aquar to adjust his manifest to carry something small that wasn't on it, which was not, she understood, entirely outside the ordinary practices of independent freight work, and which she would explain to him directly because she had neither the time nor the inclination to be indirect about something this large. She would need to replace the original chip so that it was found through proper channels, logged, returned, and traceable in a way that led nowhere near her. She would need her brother Ver, who worked in the Home Systems Territorial Coordination Office and who had not heard her voice in 11 months, to understand immediately and completely what she was sending and what needed to happen next. None of this was a good plan. It was, she recognized with the clarity of someone who has genuinely exhausted the other options, the plan that remained after the good ones were gone, which was its own category of plan entirely. She stood up from the maintenance bench, which her back received as long overdue. She checked the time. Aquar's freight manifest had him in Bay 14 by 600 hours for a departure window that didn't open until 8, which gave her a gap in which he would be present, and not yet occupied with anything she would be interrupting. She needed to be in Bay 14 by 6. She had, currently, rooms to finish cleaning, a chip to copy, an original to replace, and approximately 90 minutes in which to arrange all of this into something that resembled a sequence rather than a catastrophe. She straightened her service cap. She picked up her flask, remembered it was empty, considered this, and decided that the universe owed her a great deal more than a full flask, but that this was not the moment to negotiate the terms. Then she unlocked her cart, checked that the photograph in the lower left compartment was still there. It was, her mother's contracted amber irises staring up at her from in front of the tidal garden with that perpetual expression of beautiful surprise, and pushed the cart back out into the corridor, toward everything that came next. Aquar Sen was, as she had expected, walking slowly around his ship with a hot beverage, performing the kind of pre-departure check that is less an inspection and more a conversation between a pilot and his vessel conducted entirely through proximity. He looked up when she appeared at the bay entrance with her cart, and he gave her the nod of someone whose morning was going adequately, and who had not yet been informed that it was about to become significantly more complicated. She told him in 8 minutes. She had intended to be more gradual about it, had constructed, during the walk from the service corridor to Bay 14, a version of this conversation that built carefully and responsibly toward its conclusion. But when she opened her mouth, the careful version dissolved, and what came out instead was the truth at full speed, because she had never been good at preamble and because there was. She had decided somewhere between the third corridor junction and the bay entrance, no comfortable approach to this particular sentence. She said it. She placed the copied chip, now housed in a civilian format storage unit, transferred in the service operations room at 5:43, a process that had taken 9 minutes and left her hand steadier than she expected, on the edge of his loading manifest. She waited. Aquar looked at the chip. He looked at her. He looked at the chip again with the expression of a man who has just been handed a problem that is considerably larger than his morning had budgeted for. Then he picked up his beverage and took a long, slow drink from it, and she understood that this was not avoidance but processing, because some people think better when they have something warm to hold, and Aquar Sen was one of them. Finally he said, in the tone of someone running calculations he hadn't planned to run before departure, the checkpoint at the system boundary, full scans or spot checks. She told him she could find out. She explained, briefly, about the freight coordination manifest room and the file cabinets, and the checkpoint procedural schedules, and the water stain on the baseboard that had required her to move those cabinets on 4 separate occasions. He absorbed this with an expression she had not seen on a human face before, a specific recalibration, a quiet revision of something he thought he understood. And she watched him understand, perhaps for the first time, the particular density of information that accumulates in a person who spends years maintaining the spaces where other people keep their secrets. He said, I'm going to need a better flatbread than the one I have on board for this. She said, the waypoint stop is in 4 days. He said, I know. And then, after a pause, I'll move the departure window. I need to adjust the manifest. He picked up the chip and held it in a way that acknowledged its weight without dramatizing it, which she respected. Your brother. You're certain he'll know what to do with it? She was certain. Ver had worked in territorial coordination for 9 years. He was the person his office called when something needed to be understood quickly and completely, which was the professional version of what he had always been in their family, which was the person who, when their mother's tidal garden had been damaged in a storm season, had organized the repair before anyone else had finished processing that it needed repairing. He was not a person who received information and sat with it. He was a person who received information and moved. This was, she had sometimes found mildly exhausting in a sibling, and was now profoundly grateful for in a planetary defense coordinator. She went back to her shift. This was important. Disappearing from her rotation would register in the staffing log, and the staffing log was reviewed by the duty officer, and the duty officer reported to administration, and she needed, for the next 4 days, to be the most unremarkable version of herself she had ever managed to be. She cleaned the remaining suites on her rotation. She restocked the supply closets on the eastern corridor. She logged the condensation issue for the 6th time, with a note that she had now logged it 6 times, maintaining the passive-aggressive precision of someone who had not just committed an act of interstellar consequence, and was definitely not thinking about anything other than wall seams. She watered all 8 moss trees in the long corridor, including the one named after the colleague who had complained about her cart, and she decided, while watering it, that she forgave him. Not because he deserved it, because she was carrying enough weight already. At 9:41, she returned to conference room 7 with her cart and replaced the original chip behind the partition, positioning it slightly less deeply than she had found it, in the gap that a small object might naturally roll into if dropped during a hurried departure. Bren's rotation began at 9:44. Bren was meticulous in the way of people who find order genuinely comforting rather than professionally required, and Bren would find the chip within the first pass of the perimeter, because Bren also did the perimeter first, which was one of the reasons Sael had trained her personally, and would log it within the hour, and the chip would travel through proper channels, properly documented, with Sael's name appearing nowhere in its history. This was, she thought, the cleanest thing she had ever cleaned. The 4 days that followed were the longest of her professional life and the most outwardly identical to every other 4 days of it, which was the point. She worked her rotation. She ate in the service lounge. She slept in the staff quarters in the 6-hour window her schedule permitted, and discovered, with some surprise, that she actually slept, because her body had apparently decided that what had been done was done, and that metabolic function was not optional simply because history was in motion. On the 2nd day, she passed Commander Sael Vorn in the corridor outside the communications buffer room and said good morning, and the commander said good morning back without looking at her, and Sael pushed her cart past and noted, in the catalog she kept of spaces and their contents, that being invisible had, on this particular occasion, saved her life. On the 4th day, she was in the service lounge at the viewport when her personal comm unit registered a message. It was from Ver. It was 4 words in Aethari, which translated into standard as something approximate to received, understood, moving now. And then a 5th word, which was her name, rendered in the particular way he had always written it since they were children, with the small orthographic flourish their mother had used, the equivalent of a hand placed briefly on a shoulder. She sat with that for a long time. Somewhere on the outer leg of a freight route, she knew, a large unhurried man was eating a mediocre reconstituted flatbread and continuing on his scheduled path as though nothing had happened, because nothing, officially, had. His manifest was clean. His checkpoint passage had been smooth spot checks, as the procedural schedule had confirmed, not full scans. a detail that she had retrieved at 5 in the morning of the first day, by going to the freight coordination manifest room for what the log recorded as routine pre-shift supply verification, which was not a task she had ever performed before, but which no one had thought to question because she had been in that room before, and people who have been in a room before are allowed to be in it again. The water stain on the baseboard behind the left cabinet was still there. She had noted it again in the maintenance log. It seemed important to remain consistent. She looked out at the stars through the viewport. They were the same stars. They had always been the same stars, whether or not anyone in a strategy session had decided to reclassify a system on the other side of them. Stars did not attend those meetings. They were not consulted. They simply burned at their respective distances, indifferent to the smaller lights moving between them, carrying freight and classified files, and the particular, quiet weight of people who have decided that what they know obligates them to act. The Vethlum along her jaw pulsed once, steadily, and then settled. She did not try to suppress it.